Right, good evening, everybody. Can everyone hear me to begin with? I hope so. Good evening. We're going to be talking about air law and ATC procedures this evening. First of all, my name is Michael Harrison. I'm a junior glider pilot and instructor at Lasham Gliding Society. I'm also a risk management officer and head of air operations for 2XL Engineering. So the aim of tonight's presentation is we're going to cover the aspects of air law and ATC procedures which you would need to know to pass a bronze exam. But we're also going to try and cover them in a little bit more detail for people who are already a bit more experienced in gliding and who either want a refresher or a bit more background about the air law and ATC procedures. Particularly, I want to look at where we actually find the regulations, so people, if something they want to know in the future, know where to look for it. To start off with, a little bit of housekeeping. So I've got the Q&A mode enabled. We are going to have a Q&A session right at the end of the presentation, so people can ask any questions that you might want to know more about. But I know sometimes when you're talking about complicated subjects, sometimes you get a burning question and you need to know the answer to it right now in order to understand what we're talking about. So if you do have any burning questions, please feel free to ask those as we go through the presentation. I have also put a couple of files in the shared files area. They're files which I think will be helpful to people who are studying for their bronze. So use this presentation along with those and along with bronze and beyond to study for your bronze exams. Moving on, this is just a really quick overview of the bronze syllabus. We are looking specifically at item number 1, Air Law and ATC procedures this evening. And this is the syllabus for Air Law and ATC procedures. So we're going to try and cover each one of those items. We won't necessarily cover every single thing and every single possible scenario that could come up in an exam, but we will certainly give at least an overview of every item there. Okay, well, let's get started. Here are some resources. They are things which would be helpful to read as well as this presentation. Some of them are quite text heavy. The ones, if you're going to read anything, the Skyway Code and the Self-Plane Rulebook and the BJ Laws Rules, they're the 3 I would recommend you particularly read. So we're going to start off with a crash course in regulations. Where does the law actually come from? So I know we hear around gliding clubs, we hear people talking about laws and regulations all the time. People might say, you have to do this, you're not allowed to do that. But we don't always know where these regulations actually come from. So let's have a quick look at the regulators and where we can actually find these regulations. So we'll start off with ICAO. ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's an agency of the United Nations, and it was created in 1944 by the Chicago Convention. And that was a convention that was signed now by 193 member states. And it aims to basically guarantee certain standards which aviation regulators around the world should try and emulate. The idea of that being, as you travel around the world in your aircraft, you should find fairly similar rules and regulations no matter where you go. Now, you notice I've put in red there standards and recommended practices, and I've written that they're not technically a regulator. Now, that's because most of the stuff that ICAO produces is not legally binding. Their standards and recommended practices are exactly that, standards and recommended practices, which regulators try and follow. Having said that, you will see them mentioned in regulations, and they are extremely helpful in helping you to interpret the regulations. The first actual regulator we have is EASA, which I'm sure most of you have probably heard of. It's an agency of the European Union. It's actually changed its name recently. It's called the European Union Aviation Safety Agency now. It's been regulating since 2002, and it's the primary aviation regulator for Europe. So that used to be the CAA for us, but these days it is EASA. Now, that might change in the near future for obvious reasons, but for the moment, EASA is our primary regulator. Now, EASA regulates by producing things called implementing regulations, and those are the laws that we have to follow in Europe. But they are very text heavy, and unless you're a lawyer, they're not particularly fun to read. So the EASA has quite helpfully produced acceptable means of compliance, certification specifications, and guidance materials, which are essentially, they're not the law, they're EASA's opinion, but they're EASA's opinion on how we should comply with the law, and they're a lot more friendly to read. They also produce easy access rules where they combine the regulations and their guidance together. So you can get handy rule books giving you everything you need to know to interpret those rules. And one of the really handy rule books for us is the sailplane rule book, which is something I'll show you a little bit later in the presentation. We then have the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK. They're what's known as a National Aviation Authority. So you'll see in the EASA regulations, they talk about national aviation authorities. Every state has one, and for us, it's the CAA. Their job is to regulate in areas that have been delegated by EASA. So EASA has chosen not to regulate some things directly. And their job is also to act as the local office for EASA in the UK. That means issuing licenses and enforcing compliance with regulations. You'll also see sometimes the regulations refer to a competent authority. For the CAA, for the UK, that would be the CAA. Now the CAA publishes their regulations in what's called civil aviation publications. And there's also a thing called the Air Navigation Order, which is actually an act of Parliament. That is our aviation law in the UK. And finally, we have the BGA, the British Gliding Association. They are the governing body for gliding in the United Kingdom. They're also a designated training organisation. So in order to conduct training for EASA licenses, you have to be either an approved training organisation or a designated training organisation. And BGA clubs essentially act as the local branches of the BGA as a training organisation. And the BGA publishes laws and rules, which are the regulations for how BGA clubs should operate. So that's a very quick overview of the regulators. We've got ICAO, EASA, the CAA, and the BGA. If we just look back at our resources for a moment, you see I've added some labels to them. So at the top, we've got the BGA laws and rules, which you can see. Let me just turn my pointer on. I don't know whether you guys can see my pointer now. Hopefully you can. Anyway, the BGA laws and rules are the regulations from the BGA. These things here, CAP 413, that's the radio telephony manual, and the Skyway Code. These are our CAA regulations, which we're supposed to follow when we're flying. SERA, that's the Standardised European Rules of the Air. That's an EASA regulation along with the sailplane rulebook. They're both easy access rules. The UK AIP, I'll come back to. And the Air Navigation Order and the rules of the air regulations, there are aviation law. Both of those are acts of Parliament applicable in the United Kingdom. Now, the UK AIP, I skipped over for a moment because you'll probably have to see there's a much longer explanation for that one. I'm not going to read it all out, but essentially an AIP, or an Aeronautical Information Publication, is something which ICAO recommends we establish in every state in the world. So every state should have one. And the UK AIP, the AIPs basically act as manuals for how to fly in that state. So they should contain that state's specific rules, how they've implemented ICAO standards, their differences from ICAO standards, also the procedures for operating in different areas of that state. The UK AIP contains regulations for flying through our airspace. It contains regulations for all of the licensed airfields in the UK as well. And again, I'll show you that very shortly. So where do we find the regulations? I'm just going to try and share my screen with you for a moment, and hopefully this works correctly. Screen sharing. There we go. Hopefully you guys can see my screen now. And here we have the Skyway Code. I'm actually going to come back to that, and we're going to just look at EASA for the moment. So this is EASA's website. You can see the regulations here. These are all of the different areas that EASA regulates. A lot of them aren't relevant to us, but the one that is in particular, or the two that are in particular, are sailplanes and SERA, the Standardised European Rules of the Air. So just have a look at sailplanes quickly. We have their regulations. That's the heavy legal text that we don't like. We have our acceptable means of compliance. This is the EASA's opinions, and in consolidated version, we have the sailplane rulebook here. easy access rules, as they call them. And this is what you get if you click on it, a nice, nice consolidated book with everything you need to know about gliding in theory. This is what a commission implementing regulation looks like. As you can see, it's not something you really want to spend your life reading through. And while we're here, we'll just have a quick look at the NATS AIP as well. This is what the Aeronautical Information publication looks like. Split into three parts: general, the general UK regulations; en route, which is regulations for flying through the UK; and aerodromes, which is the procedures for our different licensed aerodromes. You also get supplements, which are extra bits that sort of aren't fully incorporated into the AIP, and circulars, which are temporary things like complicated danger areas or changes to procedures, things like that, or sometimes temporary controlled airspace, like when the red arrows are doing a display. That sort of stuff will appear there as well. Right, and let's see if I can stop sharing the screen and go back. Cool. So that's just the basic idea where you find the regulations. If you just Google EASA, their website will come up, or if you Google AIP, the NATS website will come up, and you can find all of that stuff hopefully fairly easily. Moving on, right, we are going to whiz through a little bit of airworthiness. I'm not going to cover this in detail, primarily because I'm not an engineer or an inspector, so I imagine any detail I went into would probably be wrong. If you do want the detail, Gordon McDonald did a presentation a few days ago, and that's now on the BGA's YouTube channel, so that's a very good watch if you do want more information. But very briefly, the requirements for airworthiness: you need to know the difference between an EASA glider and a non-EASA glider. So the key difference, as written on the screen, is whether production was stopped before 1975. And the reason that we need to know whether our glider is EASA or non-EASA is because it affects our maintenance requirements, and it also affects our flight crew licensing requirements. So if we move on to the next slide, if it will let me. There we go. We'll have a quick look at our responsibilities. Really, when it comes to airworthiness, there are three people that have responsibility for a glider, and that's the owner, the pilot, and the inspector. So the owner is simply the person who owns the glider. In a syndicate, there might be somebody specifically designated to do this sort of thing. If it's a club, then it will be up to the club's rules. It might be the committee, it might be the chairman, there might be a designated equipment officer or maintenance manager who's actually responsible for this stuff. But the owner is responsible for the airworthiness and the maintenance management of the glider. So that means making sure that all of the things that need to happen to keep the glider airworthy are happening, and making sure that the glider's got all the documentation it needs to be legal. We then get the pilot. Now, the pilot is responsible for ensuring that the glider is airworthy on that particular day. That means carrying out pre-flight inspection. And in brackets there, we've got our daily inspection. So that is a legal requirement to carry out a daily inspection. But the pilot in command shouldn't just rely on a signature being in a DI book to ensure that a glider is airworthy. They should actually be checking the glider, like walking around before every flight they do, just making sure it looks airworthy. Because if something was broken, just saying, well, somebody signed off in the morning wouldn't necessarily be good enough, especially if it was something obvious like the tailplane's fallen off, for example. And finally, you have the inspector. Now, the inspector has to have a qualification to be an inspector, and they are responsible for actually performing maintenance on the glider and signing the paperwork. So that means signing certificates of release for service, signing the glider's logbook, etc., to keep the glider's paperwork in order. So here are some more detailed requirements for non-EASA gliders. Essentially, they are regulated under the Air Navigation Order, not under EASA regulations. They follow an annual maintenance program, but essentially what they need is an annual inspection. That's the primary piece of maintenance you have to do to a non-EASA glider. They do also have to hold a BGA certificate of airworthiness, and that has to be renewed every year. If we think about EASA gliders now, which is what a majority of gliders probably are, they are governed by a thing called EASA Part M, which is continuing airworthiness requirements. They have to display national registration markings. They have a non-expiring EASA certificate of airworthiness, but in place of having a new C of A issued every year, they actually have to have what's called an ARC, or an airworthiness review certificate, issued every year. And that's when an inspector goes through all of the glider's documentation, except for the insurance, and just make sure that the glider is complying with everything it needs to comply with to be airworthy. It also has to have a brief inspection done. That inspection is not the same as the annual inspection, which is part of the glider's aircraft maintenance program. That's a much more in detailed inspection, which also has to be done every year, but not necessarily at the same time as the ARC. These are the documents that the inspector will check and that will have to be kept up to date on EASA gliders. GMP, that's the general maintenance program for the BGA produced for gliders. Certificate of airworthiness. You do have to have a radio license if you've got a radio on board, and your placards in your cockpit. You can't just put whatever you want. The placards do actually have to be true to life, so that they should be getting checked as well. Now, thinking about pilot maintenance for a moment. Inspectors aren't the only people who can do maintenance. Pilots can actually do maintenance as well, but before you can do that, you should be a qualified pilot, and you should also actually own the glider or be involved with the glider that you are maintaining. If you're not, then you should be an inspector. Now, you can't do everything. There are specific things that pilots can do. If it's complicated, you probably can't. It probably needs to be an inspector. But yeah, if you look in the glider's aircraft maintenance program, that should tell you pretty much what it is you can and can't do as a pilot. Right, and I think this is the last part of our airworthiness bit, is the aircraft's markings. So gliders do have to have markings if they are EASA gliders. If they are non-EASA gliders, they don't. Now, what we mean by markings is essentially the glider's G reg. That's G dash something or other, G dash ABCD, for example. There's loads of requirements for how they have to be displayed, which we won't go into. But essentially, the things you need to know is that you display aircraft markings on either the fin or the tail on both sides, and they should also be displayed under the port wing with the letters pointing towards the leading edge. Don't need that if it's a non-EASA glider, only if it's an EASA glider. You also get BGA markings. The BGA number, which is BGA followed by 4 numbers, should be displayed on the glider. The glider doesn't need to have a 3-letter comp number, but obviously if you want to fly a competition, then it should. Cool. Licensing and medicals. Right. We're going to skim through this because it's a huge topic, and we could make a several-hour presentation just on this if we wanted to, which I'm sure people have. So I won't go through everything that's written on the screen, but solo endorsement. Essentially, you need to be 14 years old. You need to complete an approved training syllabus, and you need to have some kind of medical declaration. Now, if you're under 25, you can just self-declare that you're fit to fly. If you're over 25, then either you need to use your driving license to prove that you're fit to fly. If anything then stops you from driving a car, that would stop you from potentially flying an aircraft as well. Or you can show a DVLA or NPPR medical declaration. The bronze endorsement, the requirements don't change, but you are now a qualified pilot, essentially. Well, kind of. I'll come back to that. As a student, with a solo endorsement, you're not a qualified pilot. You are a student pilot, meaning everything you do has to be authorized by an instructor, and every flight you do should be signed off in your logbook by that instructor. Whether it's a bronze badge, you now don't need an instructor's authorization. That does, however, mean that you are personally responsible for everything you do. You can't blame the instructors anymore, or you can try, but we don't like it. And then you get your cross-country endorsement. So initially, you can't fly cross-country. Once you have a cross-country endorsement, you can. The medical requirements still don't change. And it's once you've got a bronze in cross-country endorsement that you are considered to be the equivalent of a qualified pilot. So that's what then lets you apply for a sailplane pilot's license, which is the EASA license. Now, when you want to apply for a sailplane pilot's license, that's when the medical requirements change, because you're not allowed to self-declare anymore. Instead, you need to have an EASA medical. So that's either a class 1, a class 2, or a LAPL. If you're flying powered as well, you'll probably have a class 2, and if you're an airline pilot, you'll have a class 1. But for most people, a LAPL medical, which is the lowest standard, is absolutely sufficient. It does have to be renewed. I think it's every 5 years until you reach the age of 45, and then it becomes to be 2 years, I believe. The age does go up for a cross-country endorsement or for a sailplane pilot's license. You actually need to be 16 instead of 14. And you need to have completed 10 hours or 30 flights after the license was issued before you can carry passengers. The other key difference when you start flying with a sailplane pilot's license, instead of a BGA badge, besides needing a formal medical, is that you actually have recency requirements now. So instead of self-assessing your recency or following your club's recency requirements for their gliders, you now actually have to comply with legal recency requirements. And they're fairly straightforward. All they say is that in the 24 months, in the 24 months prior to whatever day it is now, you have to have completed what it says there. So 15 launches and 2 training flights. That's just 2 flights with an instructor on board, and the instructor signs your logbook to say they happened. You also need a launch endorsement on your license. So that could be a winch launching endorsement, an aerotow endorsement, car launching, bungee launching, etc. They just qualify you to do certain types of launches. You have to have done 5 launches in the past 2 years to be qualified to do that type of launch, except for bungee launching, where you only need to have done 2. Because bungee launching is a bit more straightforward. And there are certain requirements laid down to actually get these endorsements. So for winch and aerotow, for aerotow and self-launch even, you have to do 5 dual and 5 solo flights. To get a winch launching endorsement, you need to have done 10 dual and 5 solo flights. So rather than just having an instructor sort of sign and say, yes, you can do this type of launch on an SPLA, it actually has to be formally endorsed on your license, is basically what I'm trying to say. Now, if you're flying to another airfield, or if you are flying abroad, you are actually supposed to carry your license and your medical on board the glider, along with some photo ID. That's not so important if you're just flying locally at your gliding club. Strictly speaking, I guess, when you're flying cross country, you probably should be carrying them, but I'm not sure how many people actually do. But if you're actually intending to take off and fly to another airfield and land, you definitely should have your documents on board to be completely legal. Cool. Sorry, I'm just having a quick look at the messages, see if anyone's asked any questions. Someone says bronze 14, thought it was 16. So bronze was 16 at one point. It's now 14, but the cross country endorsement is still 16. So yeah, that is something that changed. Right, moving on from that. Some definitions. The reason I've included this page is because the syllabus for the Air Law exam specifically requires you to know the definitions of these 3 things. So rather than burying them away in other topics, I thought it might be helpful to have the definitions explicitly spelled out. So what is legal daylight? It's not the obvious, we might obviously think, which is sunrise to sunset. It's actually 30 minutes before sunrise to 30 minutes after sunset. And that is actually different to the ICAO standards, which I believe only specify 15 minutes before and after. But because the UK is fairly far north, or Europe's fairly far north, EASA have decided that actually 30 minutes sunrise to sunset is acceptable. Now, flight time is not just the time that your airplane's in the air. Any time that you're moving with the intention of flying, you are flying. So when you first start rolling down the runway on an aerotow, the moment your wheel starts turning, you are flying. And the moment your wheel comes to rest after landing, you have now started flying. When you're flying a motor glider, if you're taxiing out to take off, you can consider that as flight time as well, and you can log it, although there are some rules about how much taxi time you can log. So you can't log 5 hours taxi time for a 1 hour flight, for example. That's not allowed, but you think you can log about 10 minutes of taxi time per flight. Dropping objects. So generally speaking, dropping objects from aeroplanes is considered to be a bad thing because they potentially hit somebody or that person's property. and that person is then fairly unhappy with you. There are some exceptions to that, though. The first thing you are allowed to drop from an aircraft is a person. So you can feel free to jump out of your glider if you wish. I would hope you have a fairly good reason before you try that, but you are allowed to do it if you need to. You're also allowed to drop ballast, water for gliders predominantly. Sand is more for hot air balloons, but we can drop either. Articles with the purpose of saving life. So if you're flying over somebody who's drowning and you have to have a life ring on board or a life jacket, you can throw it out of your aircraft to help them, although your aim better be pretty good. And aerotow ropes, you can pick them up and you can drop them. Generally, that has to be at an aerodrome, and sometimes aerodromes will actually specify specific places for that to happen, in which case you have to comply with that as well. So you can't just drop an aerotow rope anywhere. If you dropped it into a field, pardon me, or over a city, that would be an incident, but dropping it over an airfield is acceptable. I've just seen someone post in the comments, sunrise and sunset, I see on the ground. Yes, that's absolutely correct. In fact, the Met Office produce a formal sunrise and sunset time for every location in the UK. And it's the sunrise and sunset time as published by the Met Office, which is the legal definition, regardless of when you think you can actually see the sunset, because at 10,000 foot in wave, you will see the sun for a lot longer than someone on the ground will. Moving swiftly onwards, right, that is what I consider to be the boring bit out of the way. We're going to move on to the rules of the air now, which is the bit I think is a little bit more interesting. And we're going to spend a little bit. Sorry, what's that? Why does the sound keep varying on and off? Is anyone else having problems with the sound, or is it working okay for people? Some people are typing. Okay, I will bring the microphone closer to me. Hopefully that works a little bit better for everyone. Okay, I'll keep talking, and if people have more problems, then just let me know. And if you need me to recover something we've already covered, then let me know as well, and I'll endeavour to make sure everyone has heard everything. Right, yeah. So moving on to the rules of the air, as I said, this is the bit I think is a bit more interesting. Whether you guys will agree or not, I don't know, but it is certainly the bit that's important. So, first of all, essential rules. What's on your screen now is where the rules actually come from. So you heard me previously mention SERA. That's the standardized European rules of the air, and those are the rules of the air for the whole of Europe. So that includes the United Kingdom. Where SERA has been, it has been or will be shortly codified into UK law. So if we do leave EASA shortly, SERA will continue to apply in the UK until it's explicitly changed. SERA isn't completely standardized though. The idea is that every European state has broadly similar rules of the air, but there are variations. And you'll find our variations predominantly in the rules of the air regulations, which is another act of parliament, that in some areas makes our rules of the air slightly stricter than what they allow in Europe. There are also some areas where EASA allows the National Aviation Authority to relax things slightly. And there are a couple of examples where the CAA has relaxed things from EASA's slightly stricter definitions. Now, if you look in the en route AIP, that will show you exactly what it's like a consolidated version of all of our important rules of the air. You'll also find in the general section of the AIP, there's actually a consolidated list of every difference to ICAO standards that we use here, which, if anyone's interested in that does show you how we differ from some other countries. Some important things to remember about the rules of the air, though, is who's actually responsible for complying with them, and that is the pilot in command. So when you're flying your glider solo, whether you're a solo student or a qualified pilot, it is your responsibility to ensure that the rules of the air are being followed. The other important thing to know is that every single rule of the air can be broken if it's necessary to preserve the aircraft or preserve life. So that means if you're flying along and you're thinking, I'm going to crash this aeroplane if I follow the rules, but if I do that, which is not technically legal, I can save the aircraft, obviously do the thing that's going to save the aircraft. You are, though, supposed to let the CAA know in writing within 7 days if you do have to break the rules of the air for any reason. Otherwise, it goes back to being illegal again. So we're going to look at the protection of third parties initially. These are the rules that exist to protect people who aren't involved in aviation predominantly. Obviously, people who've got nothing to do with aviation don't want to get hurt or even killed by the way we fly our aircraft. So these rules are intended to protect them. The most important rules are the negligent and reckless operation rule, the glide clear rule, the 500-foot rule, and the 1,000-foot rule. And there are also UK-specific variations to those rules and some additions to those rules. So negligent and reckless operations is probably the most straightforward one to understand. That simply says don't fly your aircraft in a manner which will endanger somebody else. So you can see the little picture there of an airplane flying through a bridge. Basically, the CAA don't want you to do that. Sorry, are you guys still hearing me properly? My apologies. I will try and be even closer to the microphone. Okay, apologies for the sound quality. I was hoping it would work a bit better than this. Yeah, so the first one, basically don't endanger anyone else. As glider pilots, the most likely reason we will fall foul of that rule would be ridge soaring. So if you've got hill walkers on the top of the bridge, for example, and you come barreling along with your wingtip feet away from them, that would probably be considered reckless flying and would fall foul of that first rule. The second rule is the glide clear rule. So that one applies to populated areas. A populated area is anywhere which is congested, so that's towns, villages, cities, etc. If you're flying over those, you have to be able to glide clear so that you can land and not cause a hazard to people on the ground. The UK has got a specific variation to that, which requires you not to land within the populated area. So if you were flying over London, for example, not that you can, but if you were, and you landed in Hyde Park, that might be a perfectly big area you can land in to not cause a hazard, but it would still be illegal in the UK because it's inside the populated area. You then have the 500-foot rule. The 500-foot rule is a slightly misunderstood rule sometimes. If you look at the little diagram on the bottom left, you see the arrow is diagonal. What that basically is telling us, the rule says you have to be 500 feet clear of persons, objects, and vessels, but that doesn't mean you have to be 500 foot over the top of them. You just have to be 500 foot clear of them. So you can be lower than 500 foot if you need to be, as long as the object or the person that you are remaining 500 foot clear of is off to the side of you. There is a couple of exemptions to that. Again, for the most important one for us is ridge soaring. You don't have to obey the 500-foot rule while you are ridge soaring. We also have an exception allowing us to practice approaches. So in some countries, you can't go below 500 feet if you're not intending to land. We can go lower than that with no intention of landing and go around if we're in a motor glider, and you wouldn't be disobeying the rules. The 1,000-foot rule, that applies to populated areas again. So you have to be 1,000 foot over the highest obstacle within 600 meters. So that means if you've got an obstacle that's 300 meters high, 300 feet high, you would have to be 1,300 feet higher than that, rather than just 1,000 feet over the height of the populated area. Exceptions to that You can land or take off at an aerodrome when and disobey the 1,000-foot rule. You don't have an exemption to the 1,000-foot rule, however, when you are ridge soaring. So if there was a city on a ridge, which I don't think there is in the UK, but if there was, you wouldn't be able to just go barreling over the top of that simply because you're on a ridge. Jordan suggesting ridge soaring in Edinburgh, which I wouldn't recommend. And then you get some UK, actually, sorry, before we go into the UK specific rules, open air assemblies. They are areas where 1,000 or more people are gathered outdoors. The 1,000-foot rule and the glide clear rule apply to open air assemblies in the same way as they do to populated areas. But you also can't land or take off within 1,000 meters of an open air assembly unless you either have permission or you're at an aerodrome. So there's some little technical details to the 1,000-foot rule there, which you might need to be aware of. Because the 1,000-foot rule only, unlike the 500-foot rule, the 1,000-foot rule only has an exemption for landing if it's at an aerodrome. So that means if you were to fly over a town at like 100 feet on final approach to a field, you would technically be in non-compliant with the 1,000-foot rule. Again, you could probably justify that if you really needed to land out in that field by saying it was necessary for the safety of the aircraft, but you would be non-compliant with the rule in that case. UK specific rules. The most important one I just want to point out is that in the UK there is an extra rule about congested areas that they don't necessarily have elsewhere in Europe, and that is that you aren't allowed to perform aerobatics over a congested area. Cool. We will move on to the prevention of collisions, which is something which I hope we would all be quite passionate about, because I certainly don't want to be involved in a collision, and I'm sure nobody else is. And that really comes down to 3 rules, and that's rules about flying in close proximity, that's our rights of way in the air, and it's how we overtake. So flying in close proximity to other aircraft, pardon me, that basically comes down to don't deliberately fly close to another aircraft so that you would cause a danger to that aircraft. So if the aircraft couldn't make a turn without hitting you, for example, that might be considered to be too close. But that is kind of a matter of opinion. That's not really laid down explicitly in law. There is an exception to that. If you want to go formation flying, provided all of the pilots in command involved in the flight have agreed beforehand, you can fly as close as you like, and you wouldn't be falling foul of that rule. On to the rights of way in the air. So rights of way kind of fall into a couple of different categories. First of all, we have to look at our rights of way when we're actually about to have a collision. That's what the 2 diagrams on the bottom left show us. I would hopefully most people already know these, but essentially 2 aircraft coming head on should both turn right. If you turn left, you will probably hit the other guy turning right. And if you're converging, then the aircraft on the right has right of way, which you can remember as on the right, in the right. That means the pilot who is on the right, the orange aircraft in the case of this diagram, should just maintain their heading unless they think they need to avoid the collision. So to turn to avoid the collision. The person on the left is the one that should take the avoiding action. So that could either mean going behind the aircraft on the right, like in this example, or if they were converging more like sort of closer together, they might want to turn away to the left instead. When you are on a ridge, that changes slightly because obviously you can't turn right into a ridge. So now the person on the right, if you're head on, should maintain their course, and the person on the left should, with the ridge on their left, should give way to the person with the ridge on their right. Now, when we're not talking about an imminent collision, we actually classify rights of way based upon what type of aircraft is being flown. And that's predominantly based on the maneuverability of the aircraft involved. So hot air balloons, don't have to give way to anything. And that is because hot air balloons essentially can't give way to anything. They don't have a lot of control. So everything should give way to them. They're followed by gliders. Now, the reason why gliders come so high up the list is because if a glider has to substantially diverge from their planned course, they might have to leave an area of lift for an area of sink, and that might then cause them to land out, which wouldn't be ideal. So that's why everything except for hot air balloons is supposed to give way to us. That doesn't mean that you should just fly along and not care about anyone else in the air. Obviously, be a considerate pilot, but you do technically have right of way. Now, I see someone in the comments just asked about paragliders. The law doesn't draw any distinction between types of gliders. So a paraglider and a sailplane are the same in terms of their rights of way. Having said that, a glider does have more of an ability to give way to a paraglider. So I think it would be reasonable to expect a sailplane pilot to give way to a paraglider pilot, particularly if you were on a ridge where the paraglider maybe can't get out of the way that easily. Cool. Beyond gliders, we then get airships. Now, airships sit squarely in the middle. They actually have to give way to gliders. That's I think I might potentially give way to an airship still because they're quite big, but they basically don't land out if they have to move, which is why they give way to us. You then get tug and glider combinations. Now, anyone who's familiar with the old pre-EASA rules of the air, tug and glider combinations were not a separate category. Under EASA, they are. So tug and gliders have to give way to everything except for powered aircraft. That means that tug and glider combinations do have to give way to gliders not on tow. Again, having said that, if you're constantly getting in the way of the tug pilots, they might not give you a very good tow in the future. So be a bit considerate when you're applying these rules. And then finally, you get powered aircraft. Now, I saw someone in the comments asked about motor gliders. Motor gliders are powered aircraft when their engines are turned on, and they are gliders when their engines are turned off. So motor gliders don't have any different rules of priority than either of those categories. You just change depending whether you're running your engine or not. A powered aircraft, whether that's a motor glider, a PA-28, a Boeing 747, they give way to everything else in the sky. You then have rights of way in the circuit. That's a really straightforward one. Whoever's the lowest in the circuit has priority. If you're higher, you have to give way. But the law actually specifically says you can't descend below someone else with the explicit intention of gaining the right of way. And when you're on the ground, you get landing aircraft first, then aircraft taking off, then taxiing, then aircraft under tow. That means by a proper airline, a tug, or by a buggy. And then finally, your ground vehicles. But emergency traffic, and that includes emergency vehicles responding to an incident, have priority over everything else. Does that make sense to everyone? In terms of overtaking, it's a fairly straightforward rule. If you are coming from behind, you can see this little thing about 70 degrees. That's just basically saying if you're coming from here, you're not technically overtaking, you're converging. But if you are overtaking, the person being overtaken always has right of way, regardless of what classes the aircraft being overtaken and the aircraft performing the overtake fall into. Aircraft should generally overtake to the right. However, gliders can overtake to the left. But be careful if you're exercising that, because powered pilots won't necessarily expect you to be to the left. You're probably not often overtaking a powered aircraft, although I have seen a couple of my flights which you certainly could overtake a glider. Cool. And then overtaking on the ground, you can go again, overtake on either side, no matter what it is you are flying. We're going to move on to weather conditions, but if anyone does have any more questions about those rules, please feel free to ask them. Weather conditions are another really important thing for glider pilots to be aware of. This is where it does get slightly complicated. I wouldn't necessarily worry about taking notes. The diagrams that you're going to see in this bit are stolen from the Skyway Code, which is a document published by the CAA. If you are studying for an air law exam, I would strongly suggest reading the Skyway Code and looking at their diagrams in there, because it's the most helpful guide I've seen to this personally. Sorry, when I just seen a question about overtaking, is it necessary to let them know via the radio? No, it's not necessary to let them know via the radio, but if you are on the same frequency as them, it might be nice to let them know. But that's kind of a nice to have rather than a legal requirement. So back to weather, as I said, I stole these diagrams from the Skyway Code because they are very good. But we need to learn what VMC, IMC, VFR, and IFR mean. We are briefly going to look at SVFR, but it's not that applicable to gliders. I'm only going to touch on that. VMC and IMC refer to the weather. So that's visual meteorological conditions and instrument meteorological conditions. VFR and IFR refer to the type of flying we are performing. So that's visual flight rules or instrument flight rules. As glider pilots, or as general aviation pilots, pardon me, we typically fly VFR. Now, when you are flying VFR, you have to be flying in visual meteorological conditions. If you're flying IFR, you can fly in VMC or in IMC, but VFR has to be in VMC. Now, whether you are VMC or IMC depends on how close you are to cloud and also what your in-flight visibility is. You see, this diagram here is the general rules, and there are a lot of exemptions to this, which is why it gets complicated. But these are the general rules, and that is above 10,000 feet, you must be either 1,000 feet above or below the cloud, or 1,500 meters horizontally clear, and you must be able to see 8 kilometers forward visibility. Below 10,000 feet, clear of cloud requirements are the same, but you only need to have 5 kilometers of forward visibility. And those rules are applicable to all classes of airspace until you start to introduce the exemptions, which are on the next slide. Now, the biggest, the most important exemption for gliders applies to you in Class D, in Class F, and in Class G airspace. But interestingly, not in Class E airspace, which is a really weird quirk you need to be aware of. D, F, and G fine, but not in E. Don't ask me why, I don't know. Basically what the rule says is that rather than being 1,000 feet or 1,500 meters clear of cloud, you now just have to be clear of cloud. That means you can go right up to the cloud, but you can't go inside the cloud. Now, there are some requirements to that. In Class F and G airspace, you have to be in sight of the ground while you are doing that. You can't do this while you are without having the ground in sight. That means you can't be essentially above the cloud. You also have to be below 3,000 feet. As soon as you go above 3,000 feet, the 1,000 feet and 1,500 meter rules start to apply again. If you're doing this in Class D airspace, you have to continue to have 5 kilometers visibility, and you also have to be flying slower than 140 knots for that to apply. Not that that is likely to be an issue for a glider. The other exemption we have, which is less useful, but it does exist, is that in uncontrolled airspace, you can reduce the 5 kilometers visibility down to 1,500 meters. Now, at Lasham, where I fly, our runway is 1,700 meters long, which means if you were using that, you would not be able to see the opposite threshold when you were sitting on one threshold, which personally, that's not a visibility I would be particularly, I don't think I particularly want to fly in that, but we can do it. But that only applies to uncontrolled airspace. That doesn't apply to Class D. As I said, it does start to get quite complicated, all of this. I would strongly suggest if you're revising, look at the Skyway Code. Actually, before we move on, because that's a change of topic, does anyone have any questions about the VMC and IMC? And I'll just quickly touch on SVFR, if nobody has any questions. I can see a couple of people are typing. While people are typing their questions, we'll just talk about SVFR quickly. So SVFR is special VFR. It's not something you'll use in uncontrolled airspace. It's only applicable to control zones around airports. basically lets you fly in a control zone in weather that technically wouldn't be VFR. So normally in a control zone, you need to have a cloud ceiling of, hold on. No, sorry, I've forgotten to mention something really important I've just noticed from the comments. So I'm going to put SVFR to one side for a moment. So really important I forgot to mention is that in the UK, we actually are allowed to fly IFR in a glider. So when you've got a booming day, 5,000-6,000 foot cloud bases, you actually can still go right up to the cloud. You are IFR when you're doing that. That means if you go into any kind of controlled airspace, that means Class D airspace or even Class E airspace, where you don't need a clearance, you would be IFR if you went closer than 1,000 feet or 1,500 meters to cloud. So you would now need an IFR clearance to do that, which an air traffic controller is not likely to give you in a glider, and I'll explain why that is a bit later in the presentation. So yes, you can go closer than those values to cloud, but only in Class G airspace. If you want to go into cloud, you need to have, if you're flying on an EASA license, you actually need to have a cloud flying rating. Under the BGA, there's a cloud flying endorsement, which I don't believe is mandatory, but I wouldn't enter cloud if you haven't been trained to do it, as there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you fly in cloud without training. So yes, apologies for forgetting to mention that. I got carried away with myself there. Can I fly into cloud in a microlight? I don't believe you can, no, because if you're not in a glider, you would need to have an instrument rating. And I don't know that you can add an instrument rating to a microlight license, but I might be wrong about that. Special VFR, sorry. Again, I'm only going to touch on it. It's only applicable in Class D airspace. It's to allow you to fly in Class D airspace in weather that isn't VFR. So instead of needing a 1,500 foot ceiling and a 5 kilometer visibility, which is normally the minimum requirements for entering Class D, you now only need a 1,500 meter visibility and a 600 foot cloud ceiling. But you need to be explicitly cleared by an air traffic controller to do that, and you're probably not going to need to do that in a glider, which is why I've only just touched on it. Moving on, we are going to have a quick look at altimetry. I can't pronounce this word, altimetry, because it is quite useful for what we're going to talk about shortly. I'm not going to give you a full in-depth guide to altimetry. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of it. Now, when we are flying, there are several different settings we can set our altimeters to. There's actually 4 different settings we can set our altimeters to. That is QFE, QNH, standard pressure, as EASA calls it, or a regional pressure setting. So when we fly our circuits from our gliding clubs, we normally set QFE. QFE is an air pressure, and it is the air pressure on the surface at the aerodrome. So when you set QFE, your altimeter is now telling you a height, how high you are above the airfield. If you set a QNH, that's a lot more useful for cross-country flying. That is the air pressure at sea level. So if you're at an airfield that's 500 feet above sea level, and you set a QNH, your altimeter should read 500 feet. That is what we call an altitude. If you look at my little diagram, I drew this on Microsoft Paint. I hope you're impressed. You see our little airfield A up here is 480 feet above sea level, which is here. And that black line at sea level is where our QNH is. So the air pressure on that black line is QNH, which in this scenario is 996 hectopascals. Hectopascals being the unit of measurement for air pressure. If we were to set 996 on our altimeter on the ground at airfield A, we would be reading 480 feet. We'd also, flying over the sea here, be reading 480 feet. But our height, what we would set on the ground at airfield A, if we set a QFE, would be 0. Now heights are useful when we're flying around airfields because we can see how high we are above the runway. Altitudes become more useful when we're going cross-country, but at lower levels, because altitudes tell us how high we are above terrain. Your air charts give you an indication of how high the terrain is, so you can tell whether you're safe or not. Flight levels which is what we get if we set the standard pressure, which is 1013, are much more useful when you're flying higher. So that means most airliners, when they're en route, fly on flight levels. The reason why we use flight levels, when terrain is no longer an issue, to have everyone on the same pressure setting means that everyone knows how high they are relative to everyone else, which for collision avoidance, which is the biggest factor at higher levels, clearly a very useful thing to be able to do. I'm going to touch on regional pressure setting shortly, but we'll just talk about how you choose which one of these to use. In the UK, we have a thing, well, in fact, in every country, there is a thing called the transition altitude. In the UK, that is 3,000 feet. So when aircraft are flying IFR, once they reach 3,000 feet in the climb, they would switch their altimeter to 1013 and they continue their climb on flight levels. There will also be a transition level, and that is the lowest flight level that is at least 1,000 foot clear of the transition altitude. So as aircraft descend, when they hit the transition level, they'll set the QNH and go back to altitudes again. That's 3,000 foot in the UK, but several airfields choose to use 6,000 feet instead. So if you're flying around those airfields, then you'd use the 6,000 feet transition altitude instead. For VFR traffic, outside of controlled airspace, it is entirely optional whether you use altitudes or flight levels. When you're inside controlled airspace, however, the transition altitudes should be obeyed. Now, which one you should use, really the best one to use between, if you're outside controlled airspace, is whatever the airspace above you is based on. So if the airspace above you is defined as a flight level, I would use flight levels. If the airspace above you is defined as an altitude, I would use altitude. And the QNH to use, if it's defined as an altitude, is the QNH being reported by the airfield whose airspace it is. If that happens to be the London Terminal Manoeuvring Area, then it's the London QNH, which any air traffic control centre in the area will be able to give you. So a couple of questions. What is the standard pressure for Lasham? Standard pressure is always 1013. That's a global standard that never changes. How would you know which airfields are using the 6,000 feet transition altitude? Yeah, it's if you look at the charts for those airfields, it is on the charts. You can basically, if you're not around the London area, you can basically assume it's 3,000 feet most of the time. I think Manchester and potentially Edinburgh and Glasgow also use the use 6,000 feet, but outside of London, it's tended to be 3,000. Cool. Regional pressure settings. They are something which you can use if there's not really any other, if you need to use an altitude rather than a flight level, and there's not another QNH for you to set, the regional pressure settings what you should use. Now the regional pressure setting, it's really important to realize that it's not a QNH, even though it gives you an altitude. Sorry, someone's just asked, what is the standard for altimeters? And that's still using millibars. Millibars and hectopascals are exactly the same thing. So it's 1013 millibars and it is 1013 hectopascals for your altimeter, whichever unit your altimeter reads in. Sorry, so the regional pressure setting, it's important to realize that is actually not an altitude. They're defined over large areas and it is the lowest forecast pressure for the next hour. So the actual air pressure where you are and the regional QNH can be quite a bit different, and it's not appropriate to use it if you're flying underneath controlled airspace. I'm just going to share my screen with you quickly again. Hopefully you guys can see the internet. And here we go. This is the chart of altimeter setting regions. So you'll see these dotted lines on your air charts. They no, you won't. You'll see little double crosses on your air charts, which indicate the boundaries between the altimeter setting regions. And you basically, if you're flying in one of these regions and there is no more appropriate air pressure to use, you would set the standard pressure for that region. But it really should be the pressure of last resort, because it's not particularly accurate. coming back to the presentation, if I can. There we go. Does anyone have any questions about that, or does that make sense? You, as a glider pilot, the stuff about transition altitudes and levels is less important. As long as you know the difference between an altitude, a height, and a flight level, that's really the key thing. Someone says assume Squawk 2000 if flying a glider closer than 1,000 feet to cloud in Class G. That's a very good question, actually. Just a bit of background: if your glider is equipped with a transponder, if a controller hasn't given you a specific squawk code, you'd normally squawk 7,000, which is the VFR squawk. We have this literally, well, fairly recently. We've the squawk code 2000 has started to be used more commonly, which is for aircraft flying IFR. I guess, strictly speaking, if a glider is flying closer to cloud and they're transponding, they probably should use 2000, but that's not something that I would be confident answering. So I'll see if I can find that out and disseminate that information somehow, because I'm not entirely sure. Somebody said we wave sites at flight level limitations regularly, and flight level 100 is often 8,500 above airfield level. Yeah, it can be. Flight levels go up and down depending on what the air pressure is. So yeah, the flight levels can end up diving if the air pressure gets quite low. Apart from London-based gliders, how many gliders are equipped with transponders? I honestly don't know. I suspect the number of transponder-equipped gliders is probably going to start to increase over the next few years. I know we're leaving EASA, but it is an ambition of EASA that at some point before 2030, transponders and ADS-B out will probably be a requirement. So I don't think it's something that we'll avoid ever. But I honestly don't know the answer about how many are currently equipped with them. Right, did I miss any questions? I don't think I did. Keep asking questions if you have them, but I am going to move on. I'm going to move on to a bit about airspace now. So again, this is a bit that can get quite complicated. I'm going to give you an overview of kind of everything, but talk in more detail about the things that are important. So we're going to look first of all at the classes of airspace. Now, a class of airspace defines what happens in that airspace, essentially. So the biggest thing it defines, I guess, is what controllers have to do in terms of separating one piece of traffic from another piece of traffic. Now, the highest class of airspace is Class A. In a lot of countries, Class A is not used very much. In the UK, we make liberal use of Class A, which is something which I'm not sure I agree with, but we do. Especially if you're flying around London, you will find a lot of very low Class A, potentially, that you have to deal with. And the Class A is a problem because VFR traffic normally is excluded from Class A airspace. There are a couple of exceptions to that, particularly if some areas have letters of agreement, which can allow you into Class A airspace. I'm not going to talk in detail about that. If you're flying somewhere where this is different, they will be able to brief you on it, but for the most part, VFR traffic can't go into Class A. Class B, we can special VFR go into Class A. Special VFR used to be able to go into Class A. I don't believe it can anymore. That was because Heathrow used to have a Class A control zone, which was unusual. Heathrow is now given a Class D control zone, which is more standard to what everyone else in the UK has. Class B airspace is not something we have in the UK. It is an ICAO class of airspace, but we don't use it. Class C, we do use in the UK. All of the airspace above flight level 195 is Class C. It's blanket coverage. Even the areas that are temporary reserved areas for gliders, which people at wave sites will be aware of, gliders are allowed into them, but they are still Class C airspace. It is a blanket coverage. There is a little bit of Class C airspace below flight level 195, but there's not a lot of it. Class D is the most common class you will come across. Virtually every airfield that has airspace in the UK has Class D airspace. So in Class D airspace, controllers have to separate IFR traffic from IFR traffic, but they don't have to separate VFR from VFR or IFR from VFR. And that's why I said earlier, a controller is not likely to want to give a glider an IFR clearance in controlled airspace, because when you're flying VFR, the controller just has to not let your aircraft come into contact with their IFR traffic. As soon as you go IFR, suddenly they have to keep you 3 miles clear or 1,000 feet clear of that traffic, which is a much more onerous requirement. So if they're quiet and you get a nice controller, they might give you an IFR clearance, but they're probably not going to be particularly happy about it. They believe they also have to keep IFR clear from special VFR. So probably that's another reason why. As a glider, you're probably not going to be, asking for special VFR clearance. Controllers don't like traffic on IFR clearances that essentially can't obey level and heading instructions, which gliders aren't very good at. Class E airspace. I suspect that's going to become more and more prevalent. We've got a bit now around Lasham, the Farnborough control area. Not sure if there's any other Class E in the London FIR. I'm sure if anyone knows of any others in the London FIR, please say. I know they do have a bit of Class E up in the Scottish FIR. I know they use it for some of their airways up there. Class E is an interesting class because it's uncontrolled airspace if you're VFR, and it's controlled airspace if you're IFR, meaning if you're flying IFR, you need an explicit clearance to fly in it. If you're VFR, you can enter Class E without a clearance. Now, there is this caveat to that. Most Class E airspace is established along with a transponder mandatory zone, which is something I'll come on to shortly. So although you don't need a clearance to enter the Class E, the TMZ might cause you more problems as a VFR glider. Now, we used to have Class F in the UK. We don't anymore. There is no Class F in the UK now. And Class G is what we call uncontrolled airspace. So that's where we do most of our gliding. Any type of airspace can, in theory, be any class. The classes define what the rules are in the airspace, whereas the categories of airspace determine what the airspace is used for. So there's no definitive rules about what classes different categories can be, although there are some conventions. But those are the classes. If we move on to types of airspace, this is not an exhaustive list of every type of airspace on this page. But these are the ones which, when I was putting together the presentation, I thought probably the most relevant to glider pilots. ATZs, you find those around airfields. They're aerodrome traffic zones. They go up to 2,000 feet above the airfield elevation, not 2,000 feet above sea level, 2,000 feet above the airfield. So you need to know what the airfield elevation is. And they're either 2 miles in radius or 2.5 miles in radius, depending on the length of the longest runway. To enter an ATZ, you do need a clearance if there is an air traffic controller on duty. If there's not an air traffic controller, then you need to obtain airfield information before you can enter. You don't need a clearance, but you do legally have to obtain the airfield information. You also have to make a transmission when you enter the ATZ and when you leave the ATZ. Additionally, when you're inside the ATZ, you have to comply with the traffic pattern. So that means the circuit direction of the airfield, and you have to make sure you're giving way to traffic that is in the circuit. A MAT is a military aerodrome traffic zone. They are established around military airfields, but I'm not going to talk about them because they're not actually part of the civil airspace structure. They are published on civil air charts. That's more for information than anything else. And the CAA do suggest that you request permission to enter a MATS, but you are under no obligation to request permission to enter a MATS. And as a glider pilot, you are perfectly free to enter any MATS, provided you don't enter the ATZ. If you want to enter the ATZ, you can always ask, and there's no reason why they should say no. A controller can't really stop you from entering the ATZ as such. They're not supposed to, as long as you're talking to them. Having said that, some military airfields are quite busy, so talking to the controller is not a bad idea, particularly if it's somewhere like Benson that has a lot of helicopter traffic, or Coningsby that has a lot of fast jet traffic. You don't really want to bump into somebody just because you didn't want to talk on the radio. CTRs are control zones. You find them around airfields, and they always touch the ground. CTAs are controlled areas. You find those also around airfields, but they are larger areas that don't touch the ground. TMAs are terminal maneuvering areas. For all intents and purposes, they are the same thing as CTAs. The only difference is TMAs are established in areas where you get lots of traffic coming to lots of different airfields. So there's 3 TMAs in the UK: the London TMA, so you've got Heathrow, Gatwick, Luton, etc. The Manchester TMA, Manchester, Liverpool, Doncaster, etc. And you get the I think they call it the Scottish TMA, which is Edinburgh and Glasgow. They're just CTAs that are slightly bigger and cover multiple airfields, essentially. Airways, they are bits of airspace below flight level 195, which traffic follows to get from one place to the other. They're normally Class A. Above flight level 195, there's air routes, but they don't need their own special airspace. Transponder mandatory zones, TMZs, you need to have a transponder and you need to have it turned on and squawking to enter one of those. Some TMZs require that to be a mode S transponder. Not all do, but I suspect that it won't be long until they all do require mode S. You can ask for a clearance if you don't have a transponder. So if you're transponding, no need to talk to anyone. If you're not transponding, you'll need a clearance. Radio mandatory zones are similar to TMZs, but this time they require you to make two-way communication. That doesn't mean you have to go, can I come in? It just means you need to go, I'm here, and I'm intending to do this. And the controller needs to acknowledge that before you enter the RMZ. Danger areas, we'll talk about a bit more, but they're areas where there's potentially danger to your aircraft. Restricted areas are areas where there is, basically restricted areas are areas that want to be prohibited areas, but there's a reason they can't be. So, for example, Aldermaston near to Lasham. Aldermaston covers the atomic weapons establishment. It probably would be a prohibited area, which prohibits all aircraft from entering. Except there's a little airfield called Brimpton, which is inside its restricted area. So the restriction is you cannot enter Aldermaston's area unless you're landing or taking off at Brimpton. So restricted areas always have a restriction like that. Sometimes around like prisons, for example, the restricted area might only apply to microlights, helicopters, for example. So you just got to read the restriction and find out whether it's you from doing what you want to do or not. These are some other types of airspace, which I'm going to touch on less. Temporary TRAGs are what they have at wave sites. So the UK has a rule: once you're above 10,000 feet, you normally have to have a transponder on. And once you get above flight level 195, it's all Class C. And the UK or Europe doesn't normally let VFR traffic into upper level Class C airspace, even though that's non-ICAO thing, that's just a European thing. TRAGs are established basically at wave sites, and you don't need to transpond to go above 10,000 feet or to go above flight level 195 in those. You can also get TRAGs to go above flight level 245, which is how high the lower TRAGs go to. But that's something, if you're flying at a wave site, I'm sure they will have a comprehensive briefing about exactly what you can and can't do. So we won't go into lots of detail about that here. TRAs are temporary reserved areas that are used for something else. So normally the military use TRAs, but they're a similar idea to TRAGs. You've got restricted area temporary. That's established for air shows. Red Arrow. Sorry, somebody's just said TRAG is normally 240, not 245. Okay, yeah, thank you for that. So TRAG is flight level 240, not up to flight level 245. Sorry about that. Restricted area temporary. That's what they establish around air shows, red arrows displays, etc. They are restricted areas, temporary ones. There will be no towns normally. Controlled airspace temporary. That's established for royal flights, for example. There was actually some CAS T, as they call it, around Rise Norton earlier for Prince Charles coming back from Berlin. That's controlled airspace. You can be perfectly entitled to ask for clearance into it. It's just controlled, not restricted. Flight information regions. The UK's got 2, the London and the Scottish. That just defines who's responsible for providing flight information and regulating flight information in that area. Swanwick in Hampshire for London, and Prestwick, which is near Glasgow, for Scotland. And UIRs are upper information regions. They just sit above the flight information regions. The FIRs go up to flight level 245. The UIRs go above flight level 245 up to whatever heights that particular country claims to be their airspace, which in the UK is flight level 660. And you might also see these appear on your chart. These are not restricted airspace. These are just some other things that you'll see. So areas of intense aerial activity. If you're in one of those, keep a good lookout. Maybe consider talking to someone with a radar. Altimeter setting regions we already talked about. Gas venting could be a good thermal, but I probably wouldn't. Maybe too good of a thermal, you could argue. Parachute drop zones, unless you want somebody's feet through your canopy, I would strongly advise staying clear of those. Glider winch launching. I'm sure a Jordan Bridge in the comments will make it explicitly clear why he doesn't want people flying through his glider winch launching zone. Bird sanctuaries. That's not restricted airspace. It's just considerate. If there's a bird sanctuary, it's marked on the map. Don't fly through it and disturb all the wildlife. And HIRTAs, high intensity radio transmission areas. They are not danger areas. You are perfectly entitled to fly through them. It is entirely up to you as the pilot in command to decide whether you want to accept the risk of flying through a high intensity radio transmission area or not. You're not going to get in trouble for doing it. You just got to decide for yourself whether it is something that you are willing to do. So when we are talking about airspace, we inevitably need to talk about what kind of services we can receive. Sometimes services are mandatory, sometimes they are not. And they essentially fall into three categories. Ignore the alerting service for a moment. The three predominant categories of service are air traffic control service. That's provided by air traffic control officers, and they exercise explicit control over you. Flight information service. That can be exercised by a flight information service officer or an air traffic control officer. And they don't give you instructions, except maybe if you're on the ground at a FISO airfield. But they will give you flight information. So that's information that will help you to safely conduct your flight. And some of those can be provided with a radar as well now, where they'll give you traffic information in addition to flight information, but it's still a flight information service. And then you get air ground communication service, which near to an airfield is pretty much the same thing as a flight information service. Differences, air ground communication service operators will normally only give you information that's specific to the airfield they're at, rather than more general information. And whereas FISOs can exercise positive control on the ground, air ground communication service operators can't. So you still operate purely pilot's discretion even once you're on the ground. Now, an alerting service is something that you will always be provided with automatically whenever you have a flight information service or an air traffic control service. You will not be told you have an alerting service, but you will have one. And what that basically is if you have an emergency or you have to ditch or you crash or anything like that, the controller or the FISO records your details, and they will make sure those details are passed on so that your search and rescue effort can be coordinated. Air ground communication services don't have alerting services with them, but any good air ground communication service operator will alert the emergency services if you have an emergency as well. It's just not guaranteed like it is with the other two. This is just a little bit more detail about the air traffic services. So what you can expect in an aerodrome environment, in the area around an aerodrome, which we call an approach environment, and in an area environment, which is when you are en route. So at an aerodrome, you can either get an aerodrome control service from a controller, an aerodrome flight information service from a FISO, or an air ground communication service from an air ground operator. Some airfields use safety comm. Those are airfields where they don't have anyone. And safety comm is just people transmit and their intentions, and anyone else on the frequency will hear your intentions and hopefully tell you what they're doing as well, and everyone kind of organizes themselves. When you're on safety comm, you just refer to it as something traffic. So Membry is an example of an airfield that uses safety comm. You would just say, Membry traffic, I am doing this. Normally you'd end it with Membry traffic as well, because there's one common safety comm frequency, 135.480. So if there's multiple airfields close to each other, you will need to know who you're actually talking to. With the other services, you can tell what kind of service it is by what call sign they use. Air ground communication services will always use the call sign radio. So I'm responsible for the air ground communication service provided at Lasham. We are called Lasham Radio. If you go somewhere like Goodwood, they're a flight information service. They use Goodwood information. They are an aerodrome flight information service. London Information is an area flight information service. The difference being aerodrome flight information services are provided at airfields, and an area flight information service is provided for pilots who are en route but don't need an air traffic control service. And an aerodrome control service we normally use to call something either tower, or sometimes you'll hit ground if the controller is just responsible for ground traffic. Approach controllers deal with traffic in the vicinity of an airfield. Farnborough Radar is an example of an approach control service. They can provide it inside or outside controlled airspace. But if it's inside controlled airspace, it's approach control. If it's outside controlled airspace, it is a flight information service. It's not a control service. And there's also area control services. So if you're flying en route through controlled airspace, you'll get an area control service. If you're flying en route in uncontrolled airspace, you'll get a flight information service. And we've actually divided up our flight information service in the UK into basic, traffic, deconfliction, procedural. I'm not going to talk about deconfliction and procedural because you have to be IFR to get one of those. Basic service is just what other countries would call a flight information service. They will give you information. With a traffic service, they'll also point out traffic that's on the radar. If traffic is being vectored through uncontrolled airspace, they'll normally be on traffic service or deconfliction service. You'll only be told what kind of service you're receiving. Normally, if you either enter controlled airspace or leave controlled airspace, or get a service where you're not required to have one. If you're around an airfield, you won't be told, like, this is an air ground communication service. If you enter controlled airspace, you'll be told this is a radar control service. There's also two special types of service. So we talked previously about danger areas, and quite a lot of them in the UK. Danger areas are a topic which is often not very well understood, so I do want to just spend a few minutes talking about them. They're not controlled airspace, so you don't need a clearance to enter them. They are not restricted airspace, so you can't be prosecuted for infringing restricted airspace. They exist to warn you about a hazard to your aircraft. And as a result, they are something that you absolutely should pay attention to, even though they're not controlled airspace. Now, in the past, some people have basically ignored danger areas and said they're not controlled, I'll just fly through them, I'm perfectly entitled to. And that's kind of right, but the CAA have taken a new line recently, and that is that they can't prosecute you for a airspace infringement, but they're perfectly happy to prosecute you for endangerment of your aircraft if you fly through a danger area. As a pilot, if you want to fly through a danger area, you are responsible for ensuring that you can do so in a way that does not pose a hazard to your aircraft. So if you look at your charts and you see danger area is anything that's entitled D something, something, something. If it's got a solid outline, the danger area is always there. If it's got a dashed outline, it's activated by NOTAM. So if you're looking at a dashed outline, the first thing to do is check the NOTAMs, find out if it's active or not. If it's not active, brilliant. You've fulfilled your responsibilities as a pilot and you can fly through it. If it is active or it's permanent, then the first protocol is potentially to call the person who operates it on the phone before you take off, and that's normally either the Army or the Navy. Normally, are the controlling authorities for most danger areas, and they normally have a dedicated phone number you can call for this sort of thing. If you call them up and go, "No, we're not. This is a firing range. We're not firing today." Brilliant. You can fly through it. You've fulfilled your responsibilities. If they say we are firing today, then this is where these two services come in. A majority of danger areas will offer a danger area activity information service. Now, what that is the controller offering it will tell you whether the danger exists right now. And they might tell you if the danger only exists in part of the danger area. In which case, you get this service in flight. If they tell you west of the zone is cold, pardon me, they often use the terminology hot or cold for danger areas. If they say the west of the area is cold or the whole area is cold, again, brilliant, you fulfilled your responsibilities, fly on through. If they say it's hot, you probably shouldn't fly through, and if you did, you could be prosecuted. A higher level of service is a danger area crossing service. Now, with a danger area crossing service, they will actually clear you into the airspace, and they will give you instructions which will keep you clear of the danger. So even you can fly through even a hot danger area if you have a danger area crossing service. I think only about 30% of danger areas in the UK have a danger area crossing service available, so it's not a huge amount. And you're not guaranteed to get one. They also will not keep you clear of other traffic. So it's not like controlled airspace where you'll be separated. You are still responsible for avoiding other traffic on that service. That will just keep you clear of the danger, which is firing or artillery firing or whatever it might be. So, on the topic of air traffic services, let's talk for a moment about the distress and diversion cell. This is something which is slightly unique to the UK. So we have an emergency frequency, which is called 121.5. That is the distress and diversion frequency. In most countries, that's not manned by any particular controllers. It's just sort of monitored in the background by controllers doing other things. In the UK, we have RAF controllers whose sole job is to monitor the DND cell, and they will do everything they can to help you in an emergency. You also do not need a radio license to call this frequency. So anybody, whether they have a license or not, please do call it if you need any help. They're also, providing they're not dealing with a real emergency, happy to do practice emergencies with people, which is something that I really do encourage you to do if you've never done it before. Even in a glider, it'll give you a lot more confidence to use the service if you ever need it. And it's something that they really like because they don't get a lot of emergencies, so they use it for controller training. Basically, if you have any issues in flight at all, if you think you're lost, if you've got a minor emergency, if you've got a major emergency, call them. Honestly, they will do everything they can to help. If you need to land at a controlled airfield, the controllers will tell the airfield you're coming. They'll alert the emergency services, literally everything. They are very good at their jobs. And they also will alert search and rescue. So we talked about alerting services before. The UK has an obligation under the Chicago Convention to provide search and rescue services within its flight information regions. We have the Aeronautical Coordination Centre based in, I think it's Portsmouth in Hampshire. That's operated by Her Majesty's Coast Guard, and they will coordinate search and rescue activity for any downed aircraft. And the DND cell can alert them, any air traffic controller can alert them. What will normally happen is the controller, if they're not an area controller or a DND controller, they'll contact the relevant area control centre, and the watch supervisor there will make sure that the ARCC, these guys here, are alerted. The ARCC will then make sure that they dispatch any aircraft they need, whether that's Maritime and Coast Guard Agency fixed wing stuff. They can dispatch Coast Guard helicopters, RAF mounted rescue, and also any emergency services that might be necessary. They will normally try and communicate with you on 121.5. If you have an emergency locator beacon or a personal locator beacon, even better, because that will help them to find you. So especially if you're flying in like mountainous areas like in Scotland, that's something that's really good to have, although really for anyone, it is quite a piece of equipment to have on board. If you outland, if you think there's any chance, well, first of all, if you have a problem, if you've outlanded, if you've broken your glider or you think you're hurt, call distress and diversion on the phone. They will help you. Or call 999, of course, as well. If you think there's a risk of a helicopter being dispatched to you and you don't need one, again, if you can call distress and diversion, you can just say, I'm outlanded, I'm fine, I don't need help. And it means you don't end up with an air ambulance rocking up, which I believe is a beer fine in a lot of gliding clubs. I'm conscious we've already gone on for quite a long time, so we'll try and make some swift progress forward. This is just a map of where the different Coast Guard bases are, so they can rescue you from one of these places. Interception procedures, something I'm going to touch on very briefly. Interception procedures are something which pilots are supposed to know. I don't know how many people do, but you are supposed to know them. I'm not going to tell you what they all are. They are available on the internet. They're global standards. Just Google interception procedures and something will come up. But the key principles are follow any instruction they give you immediately. Not that, I mean, if you've got a typhoon or a helicopter off your wing, I suspect you probably would anyway, but follow the instructions. If you're in contact with the controller, tell them you've been intercepted, so they know that you're likely to do unpredictable things. Attempt to establish contact with the aircraft that's intercepted you on 1215. That is the frequency they will try and get hold of you on. So if you're not listening to it, it's probably worth tuning it if you've been intercepted. The main signals are follow me, you may proceed, or land here. If they want you to follow me, they will come up normally next to you, sort of off to the front, off to the side of it, and they will rock their wings. That means follow me. They might also flash all their lights. That's another way. Acknowledge, either talk to them on the radio or just rock your wings as well. You may proceed. That means whatever, for whatever reason they had intercepted you, is no longer necessary, and they're allowing you to go on your journey as you planned. They normally do that by suddenly and abruptly breaking away. This can mean something else. If they genuinely think that you are a threat, sometimes they will actually do that to show you they've got missiles. So you want to be clear that they are actually telling you to proceed and they're not threatening you, which is something that they will do if they think you're a genuine threat to national security. And land here. If you've received follow me and they think you are a threat, but you are compliant, then a land here signal is quite probable. They'll normally fly to the airfield they want you to land at. They will fly over the runway they want you to land on, and then they will lower their landing gear and turn their landing light on. That is how they will indicate they want you to land. You should acknowledge that. If you have it by lowering your undercarriage or by flashing your landing light in a glider, you might not have either. So you just rock your wings and say, yes, I'm doing it. And then obviously you need to do whatever you need to do to land safely. That's all I'm going to say about the interception procedures. Please do take the opportunity to look them up in more detail. Right, using other aerodromes. We've got two more things to talk about. Have I ever been intercepted? No, I haven't. Luckily. Two more things to talk about. That's interception, using other aerodromes, and then finally reporting procedures. So we're going to cover using other aerodromes first. These are the signals that you may receive through the use of lights from an air traffic controller at another airfield. If they need to contact you and for some reason they can't contact you on the radio, you're probably not likely to see these lights. But I know bronze tests are a real, they like asking this stuff, basically. Even though you're unlikely to ever come across it in your career, the chances of you being asked this in a bronze test are actually quite high. So basically there's different types of signals shown by different types of either colors and flashing or steady lights, and they have different meanings if you're either in flight or underground. So you just basically treat it as whatever instruction that it complies with or is associated with, and you do that. I'm not going to go through them all. Again, it's something you want to read in more detail and try and learn kind of a bit off by heart if you're going to be taking the bronze test soon. When you are using another aerodrome, you need to know how to use that aerodrome, and especially if it's not a gliding club, the way they operate might be quite a bit different how we operate at gliding clubs. So this, what you can see on the screen now, is a standard circuit pattern for an airfield. Most airfields, if they are licensed airfields, will have an aerodrome traffic zone. And as I said before, you do need to either ask permission or get airfield information before entering. Most airfields, if you need to land there, are not going to stop you from doing so. They will not be happy if you rock up and just land without speaking to them. But if you call up and go, I need to land, no airfield is likely to stop you from doing that. So please feel free to call someone up and go, may I land at your airfield, please? Just make sure if they've got an ATZ, you ask permission or get the airfield information. Once you are inside the ATZ, or once you are in the vicinity of the airfield, you are expected to give way to traffic in the circuit, and you are expected to conform to the circuit pattern. You may be told over the radio how the controller wants, or the FISA or the ground aircraft operator wants you to join. You need to, obviously you may not be able to comply with what their requests are being in a glider. If you can't, just say unable and tell them why, and hopefully they will help you out. but it is useful to know what other people are doing. So that's a standard circuit pattern with a crosswind join, a downwind join, a base leg join, and a straight-in approach. Straight-in approaches at busy airfields are really poor airmanship. Please don't do them unless you absolutely have to. Normally, you should do whatever the join being used by the majority of the traffic is, and you should make calls when you're on downwind, on final, when you're overhead, and any other call that you're asked to make in addition to those. This is a standard overhead join. A lot of airfields in the UK use them. What they basically entail is arriving overhead the airfield, normally 1,000 feet above the circuit height, and the circuit's normally about 1,000 feet above the airfield. So we're talking about 2,000 feet above the airfield here. And normally you join 2,000 feet overhead, you report overhead, and then either when you're instructed, if it's controlled, or at your discretion if it's not, you then descend on what they call the dead side, which is the opposite side to where the pilots are flying their traffic. Powered airfields don't normally have traffic patterns on both sides like we sometimes do at gliding clubs. It's normally on one side or the other. And then you fly a crosswind leg, a downwind leg, a base leg, and a final. If you can't do any of this for some reason, please just say on the radio so that they know you need to do something different. Don't just go off and do your own thing without telling anyone. That is poor airmanship. Someone's just said, yep, Jordan recently did a communications lecture. It was a very good communications lecture. If you want more information about using the radio, I suggest you have a look at that because it's a very good presentation. But that is your standard overhead join. Right, aerodrome signals. There's a lot there. You do need to know roughly what most of these mean. Okay, you don't need to know them all off by heart, but you do need to know roughly what most of these mean. Now, the first thing to know, when we land at gliding clubs, we often use the brass. That's not necessarily allowed at airfields. They might, they probably want you to land somewhere specific, and you should land where they want you to. You might see one of these signals displayed in their signal square. Most airfields have a signal square. One of the rules about flying at other aerodromes is once you're inside the ATZ, you normally make all turns to the left. The exception is if you see this sign here, which means make all turns to the right. This little T will tell you if for some reason you can't ask over the radio. This T will tell you which direction is in use for takeoff and landing. You land parallel with the stalk of the T and towards the cross. Is the rule. These X's indicate areas that are closed. They're not suitable for aircraft. A white X is used on a run. No, it's not. A white X is used on a taxiway, and a yellow X is used on a runway. These signals indicate whether you need to use hard surfaces. If you see this one with black lines, that means you must land on a hard surface, but once you've landed, you can use soft surfaces. If you see this one without the black lines, that means all movements are confined to hard surfaces, so you should not use the brass. This signal down here, that means gliding is in progress. You will see this painted on the perimeter track at Lasham. I don't know how other gliding clubs do this, but this indicates that gliding is happening. This might be displayed in place of that and just tell you which runway is in use through numbers instead. This tells you where to go to pay your landing fee after you've landed. This is the aeronautical reporting office, as they call it. If you've landed somewhere you weren't expecting to, that is normally a good place to go after you've landed. And then these two. These are quite important ones. This single diagonal line, that means that there is a hazard and you should exercise caution. Obviously, you don't know what the hazard is, so you have to exercise a lot of caution. And this cross means do not land. This airfield is hazardous. So you don't know what the hazard is. So if you see this cross, I really think twice about landing there. It could be quite a big hazard for all you know. These just tell you about taxiways. So black signs tell you what you're on, and yellow signs tell you what you're about to enter normally. These red signs here, if it's red, it means it's a runway. And runways always have hold bars short of them, or they should do. If you are on the side of the hold bars where you have the solid lines in front of you, you cannot cross those generally without a clearance. If you're on the side where you have the dashed lines in front of you, you can feel free to cross over, which it makes sense, because if you're going that way, you're entering the runway, and if you go that way, you're exiting the runway. At big airports that you're not likely to be landing at, you may also have a stop bar. Those are red illuminated lights across the taxiway. You are not allowed to cross those while they're illuminated. The lights should be extinguished before you cross them. This stuff's all in, I believe, in the BGA laws and rules. It's also in the Skyway Code. Honestly, the Skyway Code is such a good resource, and I strongly recommend anyone who's coming up to their bronze tests reads it. But that's basically your brief overview of signs at airfields. Other things you need to know about airfields: if you are landing on the grass, then and you're not confined to the hard surfaces, the rule is you exit to the left. So after you've touched down, you should not taxi your glider off to the right. Anyone behind you won't be expecting you to do that. It's always exit to the left at these airfields. And as a consequence, if someone is already on the ground, you should land to the right of them. Now, if it's an actual runway, you are not allowed to land on an occupied runway, on me, unless you've been given an explicit clearance to do so. You can't just decide, oh yeah, that aircraft is far enough down the runway, I'll land behind it. That's not allowed. Obviously, in a glider, you don't necessarily have a lot of choice in the matter, so you might be forced to declare an emergency if you can't avoid doing that. But if you're at an airfield where it's just there's not really a runway, it's just a general grass area, that's when either landing to the right if someone's already there, or exiting to the left if you've landed, becomes applicable. If you are at a controlled airport, you cannot move without the permission of the Air Traffic Control Service anywhere on the ground. If you're at an uncontrolled airport, you cannot move without the permission of either the Flight Information Service or the permission of the aerodrome operator. Normally, the permission of the aerodrome operator to move around the aerodrome is implied, providing you comply with the procedures of the aerodrome. Hopefully that all makes sense. Right, so we're on to incident and accident reporting. Basically, the first thing you need to know is what the difference between an incident, a serious incident, and an accident are. These are all things that are defined by ICAO, and they should be recognised globally. An accident is something can only happen if people are on board the aircraft and that aircraft is intending to go flying. If you're just sitting in the aircraft with no intention of flight, you can't technically have an accident. It would be an incident, a serious incident. But an accident only happens if either the aircraft sustains a damage or structural failure, normally so severe that it affects the performance, handling, or structural integrity of the aircraft. If a person is fatally or seriously injured, but that doesn't apply if the person was injured by something that isn't the aircraft, like if you punch someone else on board the aircraft, that doesn't count as an accident. Or if somebody is hiding in an area that wasn't intended for people and they get injured, that's also not an accident. An accident also happens if the aircraft is missing or inaccessible, and it only becomes an accident in that case once the official search for the aircraft is ended. If it's not an accident, then it must be an incident. So an incident is any other occurrence which affects or could affect the safety of the aircraft or of the operation, but it's not an accident. So incidents are what most things are. Serious incidents are things where it was nearly an accident. And the only real difference between an accident and an incident, or a serious incident, is whether or not somebody was injured or the aircraft was damaged. So if something happened and the aircraft by all rights should have been damaged, but somehow they got away with it, that's a serious incident. Now, there's requirements to report accidents, incidents, and serious incidents. You have to report them to potentially any one or all three of these people. Now, if it's only an incident, it only has to be reported to the BGA, and you've got up to a month to report that. But you do have to report incidents to the BGA. If it's a serious incident, it must also be reported to the Air Accident Investigations Branch, and that must be done as soon as practical. The responsibility for reporting lies with the pilot. If the pilot can't do it, it lies with the operator. And if the operator can't do it, it lies with anyone else who watched it happen. The operator, in the case of a gliding club, would be the gliding club. If the AIB have to be informed, then the BGA no longer accept a month. They now want to be informed within 24 hours. The police only have to be informed if it was an accident, not if it was an incident or a serious incident. We also have mandatory occurrence reports, voluntary occurrence reports, and internal occurrence reports. Mandatory occurrence reports are things that must be reported to the CAA. You don't have any discretion on that. And what exactly is defined as an MOR is defined in a very wordy document. I can't remember the name now. It's a European Commission implementing regulation, and they've actually put it in the. There's a thing where you can share files on this presentation, and I've put it in there. But that basically tells you what is a mandatory occurrence report. An MOR has to be filed within 72 hours of the occurrence. And occurrences don't necessarily have to be accidents or serious incidents. There's lots of things like a rejected takeoff as an MOR, unless it's a light aircraft. But I won't go into all the details. But just because it wasn't an accident or an incident doesn't necessarily mean it's not reportable. Generally, if you think there was any chance that safety could have been jeopardized, then it should be an MOR. A voluntary occurrence report is exactly the same thing as a mandatory occurrence report. It still goes to the CAA. It just means it isn't mandatory, and you should fill one of those out if you feel something's happened which isn't mandatory to report, but you think it probably maybe should be reported so that the CAA are aware of it, because it might be a new emerging threat that nobody's considered yet. And internal occurrence reports are things that don't go to the CAA. They're filed in line with organisational safety management systems. The BGA has a safety management system. Individual gliding clubs are now starting to get safety management systems too. They will normally have a policy on what should be reported and what shouldn't, but ultimately you can report anything that you need to report. As has just been mentioned in the comments, one thing that is mandatory reportable is airspace busts. Air traffic controllers have absolutely zero discretion these days on whether they file an MOR on an airspace bust. If the controller doesn't MOR your airspace bust, no matter how minor, they will potentially get into trouble for it. MORs may be filed. There are different things you have to MOR depending on who you are, whether you're air navigation service personnel, whether you're a pilot, whether you're an aerodrome operator or an engineer. If something happens, you just have to kind of look at the regulations and see if I have to report that. But generally, reporting is a good thing because that's how we determine problems with safety that we can solve. And I think that is the last slide. It is the last slide. So any questions? I know we've been talking for a very long time. I'm going to switch to the Q&A mode. So anyone who's had enough of hearing me talk, I will not be offended if you log off now. But anyone else who wants to ask any questions, even if they're about something which I haven't talked about, please feel free and I'll do my best to answer everything. I will make this presentation available to people who want it. I believe it will also be uploaded to the either Junior Gliding or the BGA or both of their YouTube channels if people want